Ben was an experienced hiker who loved seeking out new adventures. Usually, everything would go smoothly, but he was in far over his head this time. As he wandered through the dense forest, he stumbled upon a strange object that didn't seem to belong there. And from that moment on, things took a very bad turn. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Ben had hiked in many different forests and mountains over the years and was always eager to discover new places. So when he heard about a dense and remote forest that was rumored to be one of the most challenging and beautiful places to hike, he knew that he had to check it out. The forest was a few hours away from Ben's hometown, so he had to leave early in the morning. He packed up his car with all the gear he needed and drove off at sunrise. When he arrived at the forest, he couldn't believe he had never heard of this place before. The forest was gorgeous, with trees the size of buildings and prickly plants and bushes covering the ground. From the parking lot, Ben could follow only one path through the dense trees. So he put on his backpack and began his journey, not knowing what this day was about to bring. He had packed enough food and water for several days, as well as a map, a compass, and a flashlight. He was determined to make the most of his time in the forest, and he was excited to see what it had to offer. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to see. The first part of the hike was easy, and Ben made good progress. The forest was indeed big, and the trees grew close together, but the trail was well-defined and easy to follow. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Ben felt like he was in paradise. But he wasn't entirely convinced of his hike. As Ben walked through the forest, he longed for more adventure. He thought about leaving the path but hesitated. Finally, he stopped and checked one last time if he had everything he needed to go off trail. And then he did it. His heartbeat picked up as he took his first steps through the prickly bushes. Ben was happy he left the path, but things soon started to change. The forest became denser and denser, and the trees blocked almost all sunlight from shining through. Ben quickly lost sight of where in the forest he was, and his compass wasn't a big help either. It almost seemed like it stopped working. Ben tried to walk the same route back to the trail, but failed to find it. Suddenly, he realized he was lost. He looked around him, but all he could see were trees. He checked his map and knew the trail should be close, so why couldn't he find it? But the more he walked, the more lost he became. As Ben inspected his map, he heard something strange. It sounded like something rustling in the bushes, but as he looked around, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The sound circled around Ben and disoriented him from his surroundings. He started to panic, and without thinking, ran away deeper into the forest. Ben lost track of time as he walked through the forest, finding a way out. His compass stopped working, and so did his watch. It was now stuck on 2:30 forever. But as Ben wandered thoughtlessly through the forest, he suddenly noticed something in the distance he had never seen before. At first, Ben thought he saw a cabin in the distance, so he hurried toward it. But as he zigzagged through the trees, he realized it wasn't a cabin at all. Instead, it was something very, very different. But he had no idea what. Ben was clueless about the thing he had just discovered. It seemed to be made out of metal, as the exterior was rusty and brown. It had no windows and was 3 times the size of Ben himself. Cables were running over and through the object, and as Ben followed them, he noticed they led back into the ground. He knocked on the metal to hear if it was hollow or not, and to his surprise, it was. Ben walked around the object to see if there was a way in, but sadly couldn't find any. Ben then took a few steps backward to get a better look, when he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. A buzzing sound filled Ben's head, and he could feel his body become limp. What the hell was happening to him? But before he could do anything about it, he was on the ground. He could hear heavy footsteps coming his way, but he couldn't move his body. All he could see were specks and shadows. As Ben came to it again, he felt drowsy and weak. He slowly lifted his head and waited as his sight came back. He wanted to get up, but he realized he was bound to a chair. Suddenly, adrenaline kicked in, and Ben was wide awake. He tugged on his arms, but they were tied as well. Shit! Ben frantically looked around him and tried to remember anything that had happened. The location where he was held didn't look like anything he recognized. It was dark and wet and had curved walls. Wait a minute, Ben thought. I'm inside the object. But how? There was no door. Or was there? Suddenly, Ben heard voices coming from outside. He tried to understand them, but they seemed to be talking in a different language. Ben listened closely as they approached the object. He braced himself for the men to come in, but just as the men entered the object, blood from Ben's head injury dripped in his eye. Who were these men? Ben moaned from the pain and blinked fast to try to get the blood out of his eye. One of the men noticed and wiped Ben's eye with a cloth. Ben was confused by his gesture, which seemed kind, but Ben didn't trust these people in the slightest. They held him captive, after all. "Who are you?" one of Ben's captors asked him with a hefty accent. But Ben kept his mouth shut. "Who are you?" The man began to get angry with Ben and came close to his face in a very intimidating manner. I'm just a hiker," Ben said with a trembling voice. "What is this place?" the other captor asked. But this confused Ben. "I have no idea. I thought you belonged to this object," Ben replied, now more confidently. He realized these men knew just as little as Ben did, so maybe he could talk them into letting him go. Ben tries to help captors. "This is our land," the captor said, "and you people destroy it. This forest is sacred, and you build these weird objects in it for what?" Ben slowly began to understand what was going on. "Please," he said, "I don't belong to these objects. If you let me go, I can help you get rid of them." To Ben's surprise, the men let him go, and together they came up with a plan. The men had cut a hole in the backside of the object to put Ben inside. But they could also use that hole for something else, but they had to hurry. Ben could hear cars approaching in the distance. After Ben and the men finished up, they hid behind a big bush and waited. Soon after, 2 jeeps arrived, and a group of men in uniform stepped out of the cars alongside 2 men in white lab coats. They were shocked to see something was put inside as they approached the object. The men in white turned to the men in uniform with pale faces, but Ben already knew why. He and his captors had trashed the object from the inside, and it was about to collapse to the ground. They had also written a warning to scare the people off, and it worked. The captors returned to their lives in the forest, and Ben returned home. The end.